And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Ron Ahnen. Ron is a part-time student at Starr School of Ministry, pursuing a master's in divinity degree with a strong interest in UU history and especially the development of religious natural humanism. He is also a professor of politics at St. Mary's College in Moraga, where he teaches courses among others, such as human rights, just war theory, and the politics of imprisonment. Ron looks forward to retiring from college teaching to take up pastoral work in a UU setting, which sounds a little like retiring forward into more work than ever, but good work. Ron?
Thank you very much. Thank you in that introduction. I am very grateful to be invited back to the pulpit. And although I'm speaking more or less on the same topic that I did last time, I just want to dispel any notions that I'm an expert on grief or that I have any specific expertise or knowledge or certainly no magic formula. What I do have today are some personal reflections that I'd like to share with you about my path through grief through a particular lens, and that is losing my sister to homicide when she was 7 years old, Rose Marie Ahnen. I call her Rosie. I've thought a lot about Rosie this past year as her 50th anniversary of her passing has approached. And my reflections have led me to some interesting conclusions. First, I find that grief is a lot more idiosyncratic than it appears. I mean, on the one hand, we talk about grief as if it's one thing. And we all know that somehow it is this kind of deep sadness and sorrow. And then later on, missing a person in our life. But I've really gained an appreciation for how different that is and how different people experience and go through and process grief. And second, and related to that, I've discovered that how you deal with grief is very much tied to your faith. How we understand death, the meaning of life, what our ultimate concern is beyond us. Some people call that God. All of that shapes our grieving process. I've heard some people say, she's in a better place, or God needed her more in heaven than we needed her here, or at least she's no longer suffering. Well, whether these phrases bring comfort and healing to you or not really does depend on your faith. And finally, I've also discovered that facts about a person's life, like how old they were, or how they died, or how they lived, also determines the contours of grief. So my talk this morning is going to journey through some of these thoughts, but rather just focusing on the different ways that I've missed Rosie over the years, I want to offer my sermon as an opportunity for you to reflect on how your understanding of faith shapes your experience of grief, whether that's your personal grief or the grief of others that you know. I believe that if we keep an open mind in these reflections, we can position ourselves to be able to understand each other and ourselves and to reach out to one another in this diverse community. In a kind of unusual way, my sermon includes 3 voices of grief. These are poems, and they are found in your order of service. 2 of them are very specific to Rosie. One is one written by my Aunt Patty. One was written by myself. And the last one is a poem by Mary Oliver. Now, from a faith perspective, for many different reasons, I went from a dyed-in-the-wool Catholic, aspiring to the priesthood in high school, to my young adult years where I was more agnostic, and finally arriving at describing myself today as a religious natural humanist. And I found that going through these different stages of faith did affect how I grieved for Rosie. And I'll get to that in a minute, but I want to tell you first a little bit about Rosie. Rosie was the sixth of 10 children in our family. She was a year and a half younger than I was. So she was actually my closest sibling in our childhood. She was my constant companion. And while she was alive, she was my best friend. We grew up in Racine, Wisconsin, which is just south of Milwaukee. My dad worked factory jobs. My mom took care of us at home. And we attended St. Joseph's Catholic Church every single Sunday and every holy day of obligation, religiously. Well, that's redundant. But Rosie was genuinely happy and kind and helpful almost to a fault. You know, her kindergarten teacher actually complained to my mother that the other kids in her class were not learning how to tie their shoes because Rosie had learned how to do it, and she was going around tying everybody's shoes for them. And I remember how much fun we had playing in the backyard. Everything from tetherball to ring around the Rosie. Anybody play ring around the Rosie? We just felt it was so cool to have that and play that with Rosie in the middle. Well, that happy life was shattered on Friday, March 2nd, 1973, when we couldn't locate Rosie for dinner. My parents called over to her friend's house, and not only was she not there, but told her that she was not in school that day, which shocked us. So the police were called. Well, actually, Rosie was a little slow getting up for school that day, and Mom sent us on, let the rest of us start walking and hope that she would catch up. And unfortunately, she never did. We called the police, and a citywide and then countywide search commenced with over 1,000 volunteers on that cold March night, continued throughout all of Saturday and into Sunday. Now, I was 8, and at 8 years old, I was not allowed to participate in the search, so I just stayed home and prayed and asked God to get us Rosie back soon. The break came on Sunday morning when her boot was found lying behind a car that had careened off the road, and footsteps led to where her body was found. Now, at 8, I really didn't know that she was in danger, so that when my dad finally told me they found Rosie, but that she was no longer alive, it really blindsided me. It's like my whole world just shattered into pieces, and I had no idea how I was going to glue them back together again. You might imagine that I was somewhere between really disappointed and downright angry with God for not coming through for us. But I wasn't. And neither was my Aunt Patty. Her faith inspired her to share her vision of how she grieved for Rosie in the face of her tragic death. She wrote a letter to the editor of our local newspaper. I consider it a poem. It's called Rosie Did It. I'm going to invite Bill to read that for us now.
There has been so much compassion over the death of my niece, Rosemary Ahnen, but also have been many people full of hate and questioning God. I write this letter following Rosie's funeral because I had a need to state how I feel. I found it has helped others, and I would like to share it with all of you who care. Rosie did it. In this world where there is so much suspicion, people opened their doors and hearts and not only looked for Rosie, but woke up feelings of community and brotherhood that were buried there and in some cases forgotten. In the cold of that first night, people not knowing the full facts or caring came from Racine, Kenosha, Milwaukee, Zion, Waukegan, and by early morning as far as away as Green Bay. These people joined hands and searched for Rosie and also searched in their hearts and others and found goodness and love. Rosie did it. Men and women of all shapes and sizes had one thing in common, a sharing in caring for one little child of God. Rosie did it. Many lives were touched and changed in these past 5 days, which was God's plan. People caring for people and praying to God helped the family turn to God and say, only you know why. Rosie did it. Remember always, God does not close one door without opening another. Rosie's Aunt Patty signs off with peace.
Thanks, Bill. So two parts of that letter really stand out for me. First is, we don't know why this tragedy happened. We can ask God, but we're not going to get a satisfying answer. But second, don't let grief arrest your life. Focus on the fact that even in this hard moment of grief, love prevails. The community rallied together in love, first to search for her together, and then to mourn her loss when she was found. I've heard people of faith say that God does not require any burden of us that we can't handle. And I think that's exactly what my Aunt Patty was expressing. As long as we have each other, we have love, we're in the presence of God. And if God intends anything, it's that we do come together in times like that to support one another in our grief. You know, returning to that Sunday morning, I'll never forget how my sister Carolyn, she was 10 years old, quite intentionally sat me down in the living room away from the others and shared her wisdom with me. She grabbed me by the arm and said, "Look, Ron, what we need to do now is to be good so that we can get to heaven and be with Rosie again." Now, if you're expecting me to say that we were all good children after that, well, that's not exactly what happened. But our faith in an all-loving God did set out a plan for us on how we could grieve together. We were able to reach out to each other and console each other, even amidst our deep level of grief, because we had hope. We had faith in reunification. And I know that that faith sustained my parents throughout their lives, even in the face of what seems like inconsolable grief. My mom told me once, point blank, "Ron, I don't know what I would have done at that time without my faith." And I know that many of my siblings still grieve Rosie in the same way. And while that is valid for them, I've found that after a while, that no longer sustained me. I know my Aunt Patty urged us not to focus on the question why, but I did keep asking that question. Why did this happen to Rosie? How could God let this happen to Rosie? Her absence just created this hole in my life, in my heart, and I needed to understand how it happened. After many years as a young adult, I finally saw that I could no longer accept a God that intervenes intermittently sometimes in our lives. I mean, why would God help me on my biology exam or with the football game or even with my grandmother's cancer if he wasn't there for Rosie? So I don't know why he doesn't intervene, but I felt I was right in that conclusion. And so I sort of became more agnostic. I wasn't really focused on this question of how God interacts with us. God was there. But I think my reflections kind of put God in a box with a very tight lid. But that actually helped me in my grieving process because I was no longer perplexed. I didn't have to figure out how to square God's loving presence with this tragedy. I could just be, and I could miss Rosie, and I could let the love of God comfort me. You know, I never let go of that why question. And even though this new theology, this new faith was helpful, it also was not. I mean, now I had understood there were certain limits for God, but where was Rosie? I mean, could I still pray to her like I used to? Am I still going to see her in heaven someday? And how do I grieve for her? One day I was asking myself all these questions when it was one of the anniversaries of her death. I was in the northeast of Brazil. And suddenly this poem came to me.
This poem, written by Ron, is called Rosemary. Smiles and fun, free spirit and joy of a 7-year-old girl remembers a boy. Her playmate for life, if not her best friend. He asked her today, why did it all end? It didn't, dear brother, her words ever kind. I've always been here with you on my mind. We never did part, though you didn't see. My spirit lives on. I'm with you, you with me. So stop feeling sad after so many years. Get up and rejoice and dry all your tears. For we still have work that needs to be done. The children who suffer, to help everyone. The ones who are hungry, the ones who are sad, the ones who now lack what our family has. We'll clothe them and feed them, embrace those who fear, to make them feel loved and safe and secure. Alone I can't do it. I need you with me, my brothers and sisters and whole family. I'll guide you and lead you from heaven above. We can make a difference. We can give them our love. If loving is giving, then this project, I trust, will help not just them, it's also for us. One day, face to face, again we'll all be, but much more in love and forever in peace.
So my question of why our relationship had to end at the ages of 7 and 8 had a new answer. It didn't end. My answer was, she's still with me. She's not alive, but she is present to me in a distinct and meaningful and holy memory. I discovered that relationships don't go away when people die. They're transformed. It's not wholly unlike the friends and families that I don't see or talk to on a daily basis. The thought of them affects my life, even if I only reach out and speak to them once in a while. So knowing Rosie's with me allows me to sit with her memory in a new way. It allows me to imagine vividly her words comforting me and giving me strength and inspiration. She can inspire me today to continue on my journey to reach out and to help heal a broken world. So my grieving again has changed. You know, my closed God box that sort of nicely fit into my faith stayed there for many years. And I felt comfortable with it there. But eventually, it gathered a lot of dust because I didn't really use it for anything. And then after a long while, I reached a conclusion that shocked even me. And that was that I didn't need that box anymore. And suddenly, it was gone. Suddenly, I no longer had the God, the Father of my childhood, that could listen to my prayers and give me what I needed. Not even the God that would just embrace me in a box. And that was not easy, because that faith had carried me through a lot of grief that I had for Rosie. So now what do I do? How did arriving at religious natural humanism change my grieving? Well, as a humanist, my focus has become less vertical and more horizontal, less transcendent and more inward. Now I appreciate that Rosie isn't out there waiting for me to be reunited with her somewhere in time and space. She's with me here right now. And my grieving started to become more interactive. My focus was that if I'm going to start talking, if I'm going to think about Rosie and talk about her, I need to do this now with this one and precious life that I've been granted. You know, I stated at the outset that how we grieve is sometimes dependent on how a person died. Because she was so young and innocent and really robbed completely of her chance at a fulfilling life, the pain of her passing has been especially acute. Especially, it's been different from the experience of grief I've had for other people like my parents and my grandparents who did have long and fulfilling lives. You know, for many years, whenever I thought of Rosie, my mind immediately went to the pain of her homicide. And I know that that's true for many of my relatives and friends. Some of my cousins only know that they had a cousin that died by homicide as a little girl. So how can we get past that heaviness? Mary Oliver, I think, has some words in her poem, Heavy.
That time, I thought I could not go any closer to grief without dying. I went closer, and I did not die. Surely God had his hand in this, as well as friends. Still, I was bent, and my laughter, as the poet said, was nowhere to be found. Then said my friend Daniel, brave even among lions, it's not the weight you carry, but how you carry it. Books, bricks, grief, it's all in the way you embrace it, balance it, carry it when you cannot and would not put it down. So I went practicing. Have you noticed? Have you heard the laughter that comes now and again out of my startled mouth? How I linger to admire the things of this world that are kind and maybe also troubled. Roses in the wind, the sea geese on the steep waves, love to which there is no reply.
my recollection is that as a family, we rarely talked about Rosie growing up. We didn't try to forget her on purpose, of course not. Her picture was in the living room always. But talking about her was just too painful for most of the family, most of the time. So while not burying her memory, we also didn't intentionally keep it alive. Like Oliver's poem, perhaps we feared that we would get too close to grief and we would be dying ourselves. We would lose the joy that we have in our life. And yet, without judging my parents or anyone in our family, I think we missed an opportunity there. We missed up the chance to carry our heavy together, discover how to balance it together, perhaps even carry each other's heavy. Then as children, later on as young adults, and now even 50 years later. I mentioned the last time when I was here that about 20 years ago, I realized that my memories of Rosie were fading. And so I wrote a little book of memories, all the distinct things that I could remember. And in doing so, without really intending it, I now realize that I was carrying my heavy, that I was grieving. And in writing those stories and in rereading them now and again, I find comfort and healing in a new way. Because as Oliver tells us, it's not the grief itself that matters, because it will be heavy. There is no way that having a sister who was killed by homicide at the age of 7 is ever going to be light. But laughter and joy and a celebration of all the goodness that she had in her short life, that goodness can come out of our mouths, even though we continue to grieve a half century on. So my faith as a humanist points attention to my remembering Rosie's life now. And that focus has helped me to center in my heart the joy of her wonderful life instead of the tragic way that it ended. And I would say that this faith I have now actually liberated me to the best way that I've been able to grieve for Rosie yet. I've discovered that I can think of her life now, and I can think about shoelaces, and I can think about tetherball, and I can think about ring around the Rosie. I don't have to be gripped with dire sadness. And that has been truly comforting. And so I got this daring idea. I thought, you know what, maybe this might help other people as well. So I've got this idea, we're going to gather together this spring, June 10th, back in Racine. I'm going to invite all my cousins and other people who knew Rosie, or maybe want to know Rosie in a way that they weren't able to. And we're going to talk about her life. We're going to set our heavy down. We're going to admire who she was. Because I think we deserve to remember Rosie for the good child, sister, daughter, niece, and friend that she was, and not just for the fact that she died so young. And I'm happy to report that a lot of my family and friends have responded very positively, and I look forward to that celebration. So do I know about grief? Well, I know that if we appreciate our multi-religious covenantal faith, that we will help each other find comfort and healing, but also joy and hope, even in the moments of death that come along so unexpectedly and cruelly, like it did to this community just a month ago in the form of a mass shooting. I know that grief and sorrow is a normal part of our human condition, but it's rooted in the love that we have for one another. I know that the process of grief can change substantially over the journey of our lives. And I know that this thing called closure is an illusion at best. You know, I hate that word closure. People have used it on me. As a Unitarian Universalist, I don't hate a lot of things, but I do hate that word. When I was back in Wisconsin for the 50th anniversary of her death, and I sat down with my siblings and talked, we cried and we cried and we cried. And it's not because we didn't have closure. And it's not because we hadn't grieved for her properly. For me, it's because I know that grieving for my sister Rosie is always going to be a part of what it means to be Ron Ahnen in this world. But lastly, I know that grief, when carried, when faced, when balanced, no matter how heavy, need not leave us isolated. We're not alone. We have community. And as we leave here today, let us be mindful of the ways that we experience grief as individuals, but also collectively as a community. And let us remember that no matter how we grieve and who we grieve, we can always reach out to one another in love.